Now, I suspect that for many of us, Professor Howell needs no introduction. I keep calling him Professor Howell because I first met him as a student when I was a grad student, and I can't quite get out of that mindset. But while I was a grad student, he left us and went to Harvard, where he now is the professor of early modern Japanese history. He has a very long CV that was just dropped on my lap. So I actually will not go over it because I'm unable to sort of do this on the fly, but he's the recipient of several major postdoctoral fellowships and awards, including a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship in 2007, 2008, and his current book project is the Meiji Restoration, Continuity, and Transformation, Japan's 19th Century. Today, though, as you know, he will be speaking about Japan's economy of fear in the 19th century. And so, without further ado, and without allowing me to stumble more over this introduction, I would ask you to join me in welcoming him, and I will turn over the floor. Thank you.
I don't think I need this. Do I need this?
I don't know.
Okay. Oh. I've got this on. I'll try to project. Thank you, Aaron, for the very kind introduction. It's nice to see so many Princeton faces, all due respect to the University of Michigan, but it is like a walk down memory lane in many ways for me to be here. So I am working on a short book on the Meiji Restoration. It should have been done many years ago. I found that it's hard to write, partly because I realized that narrating the play-by-play of the last years of the Tokugawa regime is not very much fun and maybe not as interesting as I hoped it would be when I foolishly agreed to write the book. But I'm pushing on, and one of the things I'm doing is trying to think about a way to talk about the Meiji Restoration period, that is the decades leading up to 1868 and then the decade or a decade and a half immediately after 1868, to think about how to say something new about the Restoration, and particularly new in a way that sheds light on how ordinary people, not the A-list celebrities or even the B-list celebrities of the period, but regular folks in Japan experienced the dramatic changes. And this talk is a first stab at thinking about fear as one of the key words for the Restoration period. So with that introduction, let me get started. I've always wanted to start something with the word overture, and I hope by the end you're craving madeleines and tea, but even if not, I want to show you an image and one phrase from a text by Kyokutei Bakin, one of the most famous fiction writers of the Tokugawa, or maybe the most famous important fiction writer of the Tokugawa period. From a short piece he wrote entitled Utsurobune no Banjo, The Barbarian Woman in the Hollow Boat. So this is an image representing the incident that Bakin was writing about that took place in 1803 when this woman showed up in a vessel that you can see on the right side of the screen on the Pacific coast of what's now Ibaraki Prefecture. The whole story is really interesting, and maybe I won't tell you the whole story in an effort to get invited back someday to tell the story. But basically, the locals decided that she was a foreign princess. Bakin wrote that maybe Russia, maybe England, maybe Bengal. They're not quite sure. But she showed up, couldn't communicate with people, and then the local villagers sent her away. This incident has a long afterlife on the internet. Ufologists, that's a real word, are sure that she was an alien, but at the time people just thought she was a barbarian princess of some sort. But the key thing, the phrase that I want to start my talk with as my overture is this, このこと漢方へ聞こえ上げたてまつりては雑費も大方ならぬ. That is, if we tell the authorities about this, it'll cost us a fortune. And that's the reason that the local villagers decided to put the woman back into her vessel and tow her out to sea and left her to her own fate. Because if they told the authorities, the hassle would be expensive and there'd be a lot of paperwork and it was just not worth the effort. So they sent her away. And I think that was Baking's way of saying that's why there's no corroborating evidence for this incident. So just hold that in your mind and I'll come back to it toward the end. Now let me turn to the economy of fear. So let us start with an anecdote. In the first month of 1808, the Mito domain established small-scale coastal fortifications at Mizuki and Kawajiri villages on its northwest coast, as you can see here. They seem to have been modest affairs, perhaps a cannon and other armaments wielded by a few men under the command of an officer. The domain set them up in response to the anxieties sparked by the sighting, for the first time since 1611, of a Western sailing vessel off the Mito coast. Many domains beefed up their coastal defenses during the 19th century, but what makes the Mito batteries opening anecdote-worthy, aside from their early date, is that they were charged with defending against both foreign invasion and peasant contention. I like to imagine the men at Mizuki and Kawajiri anxiously scanning the horizon for unknown vessels, trying to focus on the task at hand, yet dogged by the specter of hostile peasants silently creeping up behind them, ready to strike a fatal blow against social order. They dare not cast a quick glance back for fear that the bloodthirsty Europeans will seize on that moment of inattention to subdue Japan. In fact, the men of the batteries never fired their cannons at ships or their guns at peasants. Nevertheless, they embody the economy of fear in late Tokugawa Japan. Fear, according to Zygmunt Bauman, is the name we give to our uncertainty, to our ignorance of the threat and what is to be done, what can and can't be, to stop it in its tracks, or to fight back if stopping it is beyond our power. Bauman's definition is easy to apply to foreign relations during the final decades of the Tokugawa period. With the nature and extent of the Western threat unclear, it was all but impossible to know what ought to be done about it. Likewise, peasant contention, especially the violent episodes of the Tempo era of the 1830s and later, gave officials plenty to worry about without offering any obvious means of prevention. A full explication of the economy of fear would address the Western threat and peasant contention in detail. But in this presentation, however, I will not focus on these obvious examples of fearsome threats. Rather, I'll start with the vague yet unshakable fear that commoners could not be trusted. Stupid, lazy, gullible, selfish, superstitious, and given to luxury. The commoners' long list of character flaws made them fundamentally undependable during a crisis that imperiled the realm. So today I'll take the economy of fear on a test flight. And given the constraints of time, I'll have to content myself with relating a few exemplary anecdotes drawn from the admittedly distinctive Kanto region. Close to Edo, chopped up into a myriad tiny jurisdictions and home to a dense population of intellectually and politically engaged commoners. Kanto is an unusual place. My purpose is not to add to our stock of empirical knowledge about the events leading up to the Meiji Restoration, but rather to propose an analytical tool that may help us more fully incorporate the social history of the countryside into our narratives of the Restoration years. Let me forestall a legitimate criticism right from the outset, though. I'll jump around the late Tokugawa decades, citing examples from 1816 to 1868 without reflecting on the very important distance between them. A much longer and more ambitious version of the paper that I'm talking about would read the drama and disorder of the Restoration years against the weight of the quotidian routines of production and paperwork that characterized life and administration in early modern villages. Many demands of everyday life cannot be deferred, even in the face of crisis and uncertainty. And this is true today. I wash the dishes, I update my syllabi, take out the garbage, and write lectures, even as I worry about climate change, nuclear war, and deranged politicians. But it was particularly so during pre-industrial times when the burdens of everyday life were such that fully indulging anxiety was for most people a rare luxury. All evidence suggests that people in the Kanto were keenly interested in the dramatic events of the Bakumatsu period. They shared reports of the diplomatic response to Perry's arrival, speculated on the radical and often bloody politics of the 1850s and 60s, and in some cases were drawn into ideologies such as Hidata nativism or Kokugaku. But it's not surprising that relatively few among them who threw themselves into full-time activism tended to be the younger sons of well-to-do commoners, or, like Matsuo Taseko here, their middle-aged mothers, just the sort of people who had the resources and leisure not to worry about the daily grind of subsistence or the responsibilities of household and village management. The economy of fear was the ledger of who feared whom and the resources devoted to addressing that fear. It refers in the first instance to the prosaic decisions officials made about allocating money and human resources to the various problems they faced. Should they send men to the sea coast in response to the sightings of foreign vessels? Would doing so undermine their ability to respond to disorder in peasant villages? Could they even afford to send men in the first place? Should they send men in response to the activities of self-styled imperial loyalists? Would doing so undermine their ability to respond to the depredations of foreign invaders? Could they even afford to send men to respond to imperial loyalists in the first place? Should they send men to the countryside in response to disorder in peasant villages? Would doing so undermine, and so on and so forth? I think you get the idea. Too many problems, too few resources. So in addition to the relative weight officials gave to their various worries, the economy of fear refers to the distribution of anxiety across society. The longer and more ambitious version of the paper would weigh the fears of shogunal and domainal officials against those of village headmen trying to keep their communities functioning, and the multitude of rural commoners whose communal decisions determined whether or not they lived in some place where, quote unquote, nothing happened during the Meiji Restoration. Although the foreign policy concerns of a high official did not necessarily resonate with the close-to-home anxieties of a villager worried about criminal gangs, or vice versa, each would acknowledge the validity of his counterpart's worries. These big fears, of course, competed with the everyday anxieties individuals felt. A young woman married to a violent drunkard surely would have had little time to devote to geopolitical concerns. Here I'll have to content myself with an example or two of each kind of fear in various broad registers. The economy of fear is important. Chronic financial difficulty plagued the shogunate and domains during the late Tokugawa period, notwithstanding the occasional successes of innovative political economists such as Sato Nobuhiro and Shoji Koki in turning their ideas into policies. Perhaps, if people in the early modern world had known something about Keynesian economics, perennial budget deficits would not have looked so bad. But they did not, and an overriding perception of scarce resources fueled the economy of fear. The actual state of government finances during the 19th century is less important here than how the perception of scarcity affected officials' interactions with commoners and ultimately their perception of those commoners. So let's consider penny-pinching moments of anxiety, like this one in the 11th month of 1865, when the shogunate ordered peasants in Kozuke province, modern-day Gunma prefecture, to prepare to fight against bad guys, akuto, gamblers, gangsters, and other outlaws who plagued the Kanto region. The men of the villages were to arm themselves with their own guns or other weapons, such as bamboo spears and fire hooks. But at the same time, the official who mustered them cautioned village officials not to overdo it on the cost of the men's bento. Taken in isolation, this episode is historically insignificant. Bad guys of various sorts had been menacing Kanto villages for some time, and since at least the mid-18th century, the shogunate had called on peasants to assist in their capture. The authorities could not afford the cost of maintaining peace in the countryside, so they outsourced that responsibility to the peasantry. And yet, the official who announced the call to arms could not resist expressing his anxiety that, left to their own wasteful devices, the peasant soldiers would opt for the deluxe bento rather than satisfy themselves with onigiri or something else. Sorry. And it's a lunchtime talk, too, but onigiri are very handy and delicious. So, in effect, the officials said, we cannot afford to protect you, so you must protect yourselves, but do so as if you could not afford it either. Economic change drove the specifically economic fears of the economy of fear. The spread of the commercial economy transformed rural life in ways that alarmed and disturbed many observers. Without a concept of intensive economic growth at their disposal, developments that we might celebrate as evidence of a dynamic and prosperous economy, such as the proliferation of consumer goods in peasant homes, were to contemporary observers just so much evidence of a decadent peasantry more interested in luxury than hard work. Thinking about the combination of a state forever short of funds and a peasantry whose living standards were rising, however slowly and unevenly, offers an opportunity to revisit what I like to think of as the junk DNA of Tokugawa discourse, all the endlessly repeated exhortations to frugality and simplicity that cluttered the official notices, village compacts, and memoranda that circulated through the countryside. They are so formulaic and ubiquitous that it's tempting to tune them out like so much recorded blah, blah, blah about holding on to the handrail of a moving escalator. Yeah, we get it already. And I don't want to make too much of this stuff, but its ubiquity, even during moments of grave crisis, suggests a pervasive lack of trust in the populace. The economy of fear also refers to the allocation of fear itself. So I'm going to get a little bit silly here, but let's say that I'm afraid of cockroaches and chihuahuas. When neither are around, I am more or less equally afraid of them both, for the threat is purely hypothetical. Confront me with a chihuahua, however, and my fear is directed exclusively toward the toy dog. A roach in my kitchen will similarly push all thoughts of chihuahuas out of my mind until the crisis has passed. Put both in my path, however, and everything changes. In a world of calm rationality, fear becomes a zero-sum game, and I apportion my terror somehow, cognizant that the more I focus on the dog's yapping, the less attention I can devote to the insect's scuttling. But fear rarely works that way in real life. The objects of anxieties blur together, and before you know it, I'm in a blind panic, unable to distinguish canine from arthropod. In the real world, the chimeric horrors of undifferentiated fear affect people like David Clark, the former Milwaukee County Sheriff, who in his blind panic could not distinguish between the Black Lives Matter movement and ISIS, and so concluded that they would form an alliance to destroy America. That's it for contemporary commentary. And so that's why I speak of an economy of fear rather than some tamer emotion. In an economy of vague anxiety, the emotions never get heated enough to forge unnatural alloys of scary objects. The idea that the countryside was in steep decline, particularly in the Kanto, was a prominent theme in social commentary during the 19th century. A sense of social crisis drove the careers of men like Ninomiya Sontoku and a host of others, including Shingaku preachers, hired by the shogunate to tour the countryside to persuade farmers to work hard and stay on their land. At the same time, even slightly unorthodox responses to crisis, however conservative at heart, fueled official anxiety. The agricultural reformer Ohara Yugaku was driven to suicide in 1858 by suspicious shogunal officials, and is an excellent example of this sort. We can see a consistent link between decadence and decline. As peasants grew accustomed to luxury, the thinking went, they lost their appetite for agricultural labor and instead headed to Edo, where a life of ease supposedly awaited them. A well-known early example of this sentiment comes from Matsudaira Sadanobu's memoir, Uge no Hitokoto. Writing in 1816, Sadanobu denounced a world that had become congenial to the dissipated and rootless, he said. He lamented that even in remote mountain villages, peasants have rice cakes, mochi, sweetened with sugar. Peasants these days use umbrellas, which were once unknown in the countryside, and have their hair styled with oil. This is indulgent luxury. They gamble openly, and since no one works in the fields, nothing is produced. And as a result of this dissipation, the population of the countryside has fallen greatly, and tracts of wasteland have appeared in many villages near the Kanto, to the point that only the village headman remains, and everyone else has departed for Edo. With outlays high but production low, there's no hope of stabilizing finances or lowering prices, with the result that the regime's stability itself is in peril. In 1827, the shogunate, and by this time Sadanobu had nothing to do with the shogunate, The shogunate launched a campaign to rein in what it perceived to be a growing epidemic of crime and disorder in the hinterland of Edo in the Kanto region. A long catalog of social problems composed at the time lists in its first pages the complaint that these days, throughout the country, but especially in the Kanto region, we hear that peasants are engaged in untoward luxury, particularly with regard to religious ceremonies, festivals, weddings, Buddhist memorial services, and the like. They spend so freely on these ceremonies that they end up falling into hardship. It is imperative that village officials discuss this thoroughly and make people behave with simplicity and frugality. The next entry in the same document laments that recently even the smallest peasants have been neglecting agriculture and devoting themselves to commerce, a misapprehension of the proper order of things that would lead to the spread of decadence. Accordingly, not only should peasants avoid taking up new commercial ventures, but those already involved in trade should give it up. Among prominent commentators, Aizawa Seishisai of the Mito domain made perhaps the most explicit links between fear and what he saw as the dismal character of ordinary people in his polemic New Theses, or Shindon, written in 1825. He denounced commoners as stupid, greedy, and superstitious. The great majority of people in the realm are stupid commoners. Superior men are very few in number, he wrote. Once the hearts and minds of the stupid commoners have been captivated, we will lose control of the realm. The natural feelings of the people are such that they cannot but covet personal gain and hold the spirits in awe. Seishisai was writing in response to the landing of a group of whalers on the Mito coast the year before, in 1824. Accordingly, the threat of foreign invasion figures prominently in his own account book of the economy of fear. He wrote, "Attack from abroad normally occurs in conjunction with subversion at home. At present, swarms of nefarious commoners brandish swords and guns. They flock together like wild birds to drink, gamble, and pillage. After their evil doing has ended, they scatter like leaves before an autumn gale, only to flock together on another occasion. The countryside is a breeding ground for these subversives, where they terrorize good, hardworking subjects and present a sinister threat to the state. Should famine or plague occur to aggravate the situation, who knows what crises would emerge? And should the barbarians, that is the Westerners, take advantage of this situation to recruit our commoners into their ranks, the resulting horrors would be frightful indeed. We must act now to adjust our policies. If there are soldiers on the land to defend it, rebellion by subversives from within can be averted, an attack from abroad can be deterred, and other crises can be nipped in the bud." Government officials were not the only ones to complain. Buyo Inshi, late Tokugawa Japan's most famous curmudgeon, groused in his 1816 rant on all the world's ills that because of too much ease and plenty, customs have changed greatly in recent times. Excessive luxury has caused both high and low to ignore the limits pertinent to their status. Opulence increases by the day and reaches ever greater heights by the month. Thinking only of their own good, people seek solely to surround themselves with luxury and become ever more obsessed with private greed. Buyo Inshi was an armchair social critic who lamented problems without offering solutions. More interesting than his polemic is a tract entitled "How Peasants Have Fallen into Hardship," a short treatise submitted to the shogunate around 1858 by Otaka Zenbei, a wealthy rural landowner and philanthropist. Zenbei's tract describes what he saw as the disruptive effects on rural society of 12 commodities and businesses: tea, sweets, tobacco, miso paste, textiles, decorative gardens, horse packs and saddles, wooden clogs in their straps, vinegar, soy sauce, restaurants, and pawnbrokers. Although the details differ from item to item, the basic storyline is that in the past, and the Genroku years of the late 17th century are kind of a baseline for him, rural folk grew or processed commodities like tea, tobacco, and miso for themselves and resisted the urge to compete with one another in ostentatious displays of consumption. And how much better would things be if only they returned to the wise frugality of bygone days? The most remarkable element of Zenbei's treatise is his attempt to quantify the damage luxury has done to the peasant economy in his home district of what is now Chiba Prefecture, an area with a population that he estimated to be about 32,800 people. Imported tea costs the average household 2 shu per year, sweets 2 bu, tobacco a full ryo, and so on. Although not everyone could indulge in costly vices like converting their vegetable patches into decorative gardens or constructing fancy outbuildings in which to practice the tea ceremony, those who did clearly overstepped their commoner station. Is that the invisible hand attacking me? Zenbei estimated that the peasants in his district spent 51,362.5 ryo, quite a lot of money, per annum on unnecessary luxuries. He argued, moreover, that the annual economic impact of such decadence exceeded 100,000 ryo per annum, since in the past, peasants produced many of the commodities on the list for themselves and sold off the surplus. Rather than satisfy himself with lamenting this state of affairs, Zenbei urged the authorities to levy a relief tax, onskuikin, on those who enabled extravagance through their participation in trade, and used the proceeds to offer material assistance to peasants in need. Paying the relief tax would awaken the purveyors of luxury to their misdeeds and lead them to return to agriculture, thus ensuring the restoration of equilibrium to rural society. Although the officials in the shogunate's finance office, to whom Zenbei addressed this and several other appeals, did not act on his suggestions, they did offer general expressions of thanks for his dedication to local welfare, and in due course, the Meiji government eventually commended his public service. Zenbei was no retrograde crank. He earned praise during his lifetime as a visionary who brought smallpox vaccinations to his village in 1858, and a few years later promoted cow's milk, all but unknown then as a beverage for human consumption, as an alternative to breast milk for infants unable to nurse. After the Restoration, he experimented with enterprises ranging from sericulture to pig farming and fig cultivation that he hoped would benefit his and nearby villages. He was best known for dedicating years of effort and a large fraction of his considerable personal fortune to a campaign against infanticide, practice common even among well-to-do villagers in the Kanto. Many rural elites around the archipelago got involved in such campaigns, but few distributed cash, much less cow's milk, to needy families, and none other than Zenbei and his younger brother, Hirayama Jinbei, took in children, no questions asked, who might otherwise have become the victims of infanticide, with the promise to return them home once they were old enough to contribute productively to their families' farms. The notion that paying a relief tax would lead merchants to abandon their trades makes no sense unless the idea were to levy a literally ruinous tax. But that does not seem to have been Zenbei's plan. Rather, he thought that the external performance of moral acts, even if compelled as a tax payment, would make merchants' hearts correspondingly moral as well. Not only would they abandon commerce and return to farming, they would surely ask leave to contribute nurturing funds, gobuikukin, to help widows, orphans, and other unfortunates. The logic makes sense if one sees the economy as a moral realm, as Zenbei did. Luxury, rather than wealth per se, was the enemy, so it was incumbent on those who had wealth to deploy it in the service of others. He lived up to his own principles. By the time he died in 1894, he had spent nearly all of his family's wealth on his good works. And so perhaps we can forgive him for not seeing the irony of railing against the growth of commodity markets while benefiting from a fortune built on sake and soy sauce brewing. Zenbei was a village headman and a prominent leader of his Reform League, Kaikaku Kumiai, a network of villages established in 1827 by the shogunate to revitalize the Kanto. Although he was surely an extraordinary man, let us recruit him to represent village headmen in general, men whose first concern must always have been their own communities within a political economy of like communities. Although his village lay in a district frequented by outlaw gangs and vulnerable to incursion by sea, Zenbei's fears were moral rather than geopolitical. He expresses no fear that peasants, tempted by their love of luxury to abandon farming and murder their infants, would ally themselves with criminals or foreigners to endanger the realm. Rather, the spread of decadent habits threatened to undermine agriculture as the basis of society and economy. He says nothing in this or his other petitions about political collapse as an imminent danger. The most important thing about Zenbei's moral vision is that he offered an explicitly economic solution to society's ills. Luxury to Zenbei meant consumption, and consumption led to hardship and disorder. The only way to rein in consumption was through a combination of moral suasion and economic pressure through taxation. Seeing the error of their ways, the rich would return to farming and contribute their surplus wealth to the welfare of their communities. For my final example, let us look at an incident that occurred during the turmoil of the Boshin War, the brief civil war that accompanied the Restoration in 1868 and 1869. On the second day of the 5th month of 1868, nearly 2 months after the surrender of Edo Castle, but before the so-called Battle of Ueno, residents of Shiro Village, now part of Tokorozawa City in Saitama Prefecture, had gathered at the home of Choemon to pray for clear weather. Members of the Sappeitai turned up looking for money. The Sappeitai was one of a multitude of military units created during the waning days of the shogunate. Its members were originally drawn from the ranks of bannermen and housemen, hatamoto and gokenin, but by the end also included numbers of servants, of regular servants, hokonin, day laborers, and other members of the urban commoner population. According to an apology composed by the villagers the following day, the peasants had behaved rudely, shitsure, to their visitors, which prompted the Sappeitai men to take custody of the headman's son, a boy named Ningemon, and cart him off to their headquarters in Tokorozawa. Convinced that the Sappeitai were simply a gang of bad guys, the enraged peasants ran amok, until, seeing the Sappeitai's official shogunal insignia, they ceased and desisted. The Sappeitai eventually returned the boy, but only after extracting a ransom of 160 ryo from the villagers, supposedly 130 as an official levy, and 30 ryo for mediation, aisatsukin. Altogether, the Sappeitai raised about 400 ryo from peasants in the Tokorozawa area during the first few days of the 5th month of 1868. We should excuse the Shiro villagers for mistaking a shogunal military unit for a band of thugs. A hostage crisis will do that. But in their economy of fear, the appearance of 30 armed men at their door was enough cause for alarm, regardless of why the men were there. It did not matter whether the Sappeitai men actually intended to use the money to bankroll resistance to the imperial forces. And in fact, there's no evidence that they fought anyone for about a month, that they had fought anyone for about a month or would ever do so again. So probably they just kept the money. But armed men had been for years roaming around the countryside demanding money for ostensibly political purposes. The Shinto Goomy, a self-styled loyalist group, terrorized wealthy villagers in the Boso Peninsula for several weeks in 1864 before finally being put down by the shogunate. Their stated ambition of expelling foreigners from Yokohama not even attempted, much less achieved. Though they have had an after career as kind of Robin Hood types because they took from the rich and gave a little bit to the poor, even as they kept most for themselves. Responses to official fears, whatever their nature, could prompt their own anxieties among the peasantry. The Cowboy Domains' attempt to organize peasant militias in the immediate aftermath of the huge Bushu uprising of 1866 is a case in point. The stated rationale for their creation was to protect local communities from the unrest caused by bad guys, a clear reference in this case to the very peasants whose protests had been suppressed. Peasants in the relatively poor southern part of the domain, actually not far from Shiro village, which was not part of the Cowboy Domain, petitioned against the conscription of brave and honest men from militia service. They complained that the militias were being organized solely to protect the wealthy, the propertied, and the greedy. More interesting for our purposes, they warned of social inversion. Militiamen would receive sword and surname privileges, that is, get the right to use a surname in public and carry swords in public, and be issued guns. They would take up the sport of social climbers, fencing, and once that happened, they would become completely full of themselves. And before long, they would think of themselves as regular members of the daimyo's retainer band, and what a disaster that would be. The conscripts would consider themselves superior even to the village headman, and they would treat their poor neighbors like so many hereditary servants. Soon the petition concluded the villages would become utterly ungovernable. This sort of protest forced the domain to back down and cancel the militia program. So here we see how the contrasting subject positions of lord and peasant, with the headman caught in the middle, determine their perceptions of the militias as allaying or causing fear. Oops, sorry about that. Oh, there we go. Opacity and fear. So the anecdotes and examples that I've presented today represent a first stab at thinking about an economy of fear in 19th century Japan. as you can see, particularly before the Restoration. Introducing a new concept requires a commensurate intellectual payoff, and I don't know that I have the wherewithal just yet to make a robust case for the economy of fear. But let me end my presentation by explaining why I think it may prove a useful project and therefore worth our time here today. I think it's safe to say that Luke Roberts' Performing the Great Peace has become one of the most widely discussed books on early modern Japan to appear in English during the past several years. Roberts' account of various manifestations of the tension between the convenient falsehoods of the official story, what he calls the omote documents, and the messy truths of the barely concealed interior of the uchi, is a persuasive exposition of the workings of the Tokugawa state, particularly at the level of relations between the shogunate and the domains. Although Roberts shies away from generalizing his argument beyond Japan, it's easy enough to see parallel phenomena elsewhere in the early modern world, as any reader of, for example, The Return of Martin Guerre could tell you. For all the pervasive high-stakes monkey business at work in the book, fear and violence are not significant themes, except in the case of peasants who exposed open secrets to win official concessions, knowing that doing so would cost a scapegoat or two his life. Roberts is not much interested in explaining the fall of the Tokugawa order, but to the extent he does, he argues that the arrival of Perry exposed the falsehoods at the basis of the omote and uchi structure and brought the whole edifice down. And I suppose that is true enough, no doubt, but it is important to acknowledge that there were many layers of omote and uchi. Domains were just as happy to trade in convenient falsehoods with their peasantries as the shogunate was with the domains, which meant that opacity was a fundamental characteristic of the early modern polity. Not knowing and not seeing what was going on was central to the way that the polity worked. So not only could the authorities not really see what went on below them, but they had strong incentives not to see. When things were stable, this was probably fine. Pissing and moaning about the moral shortcomings of peasants was already a tired trope by the outset of the 19th century. But so long as villages paid their taxes and maintained the facade of order, the authorities were not really interested in intervening in their internal disputes, however outrageous the injustices meted out to the weak or discontented. Once the facade of order cracked, however, and the authorities had to confront the fact of just how little they really knew about their subjects, they succumbed to their fears, and paramount among them, their fear of disorder. From the commoner's standpoint, being left alone to deal with their own problems in their own way had many advantages. Foremost among them, of course, was the ability to maintain agency over their own affairs. But it's important to emphasize the weight of the economic component as well. Bringing the authorities in to solve problems could generate not only mountains of paperwork, but also great expense, for local communities were generally expected to pay for at least a share of the cost of any investigation. And so fear and economic prudence came together in the eyes of village administrators. I think that the concept of an economy of fear ought to be scalable to many times and places. With regard to 19th century Japan, however, the economy of fear offers a way to think about governmentality and visibility. A regime built on open secrets functions surprisingly well, but the opacity its institutions required made it vulnerable to systemic crisis. It was practically the inverse of a Foucauldian gaze. When the activities of outlaws, masterless samurai, and other bad guys caused commoners to demand their authorities' gaze, the authorities turned away in a fog of denunciations of commerce and lax morals. Unable to command the gaze of the Tokugawa regime, commoners were ready, perhaps, for the emperor's leveling gaze of subjectivity, Ishidojin, during the decades following the coup of 1868. And so let me just end coming back to Bakin and this key line, if we tell the authorities about it, it'll cost us a fortune. So let's just shut up and deal with it ourselves. So thank you. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So now we have about half an hour for questions before we need to relocate to the other room. So we're happy to take questions from the floor. I can pass around the mic if it's, is it still up here? Or?
Yeah. Over here,
Okay,
and
there's a mic
I can
over there.
take
So
it to people.
Please, the audience, if you have questions after this fascinating talk.
Well, thanks for coming. Oh.
I just maybe we could start with a more general question about terminology. Why did you choose, say, fear? You mentioned this, fear versus like something much more generalized or a little softer word like anxiety.
Yeah. Well, partly I wanted to find a word that captured the pervasive sense of crisis, and anxiety can be an explanation for crisis. But I think I wanted a more dramatic word, maybe to heighten my sense of impending doom being a kind of commonplace of the lexicon of social and political commentary at the time. And that's partly, I think, also because, once upon a time, the Tokugawa period was seen as the dark ages of Japanese history, a grim feudal police state, people always on the verge of starvation and so on. Now we have a much sunnier view. Economy is growing, culture is flourishing, it's wonderful, it's a kind of wonderland, and it's too bad we ever became modern. And I drank that Kool-Aid. It's quite tasty. I recommend it highly. But at the same time, that's not the vibe that you get from reading Tokugawa documents. They live in a postmodern wonderland, but rather that everything's just always in decline. And so I thought fear was a better word than anxiety, especially for the 19th century because they're always anxious. And so taking to 11, I think, is what I was trying to go for.
So, just to follow up with that, if I were to use the word fear, I'd also associate it with kind of bodily peril.
Yeah.
And is that also part of what you might be pointing to, or is it really, this is more sort of a psychological fear?
Well, I think it's both. That on the authorities' side, they don't trust commoners, really, I think. So in that sense, they're kind of afraid of them. But I think from the commoners, at least in the Kanto, reading documents from the countryside in the 1860s, I really get the sense that more than regime change, more than foreign invasion, people are really worried about the gamblers and gangsters who are roving around the countryside, extorting money from people, kidnapping poor Ningemon. And I don't think the gangsters are actually killing many people, but still having armed men show up at your door is a kind of bodily fear. Yeah.
I have lots of questions, I'm sorry. Yeah. So I'll try to make it concise.
Yeah.
So as an outsider to this period, I have many questions which pertain to, I think, sort of holes in your generalization, and so I want to just ask you to bring out some of those. So one is vertical and one's horizontal. So starting with horizontal, which is easier, which is the geographical differences, and you only talked about Kanhashu, right, the Kanto. And Luke's book is from a different area. So I was wondering if there are any differences in terms of the level of fear or and also more development in industry in other areas, etc. So I think the administration itself has a different kind of mentality. So I wonder if you can generalize from your Kanto. And of course, that's a central area, so I understand that. So that's one, okay? So the other is in terms of historical sources, your description of fear seems to be, I may have heard it incorrectly, but pertaining to mostly the administration at the top. So they have the greatest amount of fear. Whereas peasantry seem to have, they even have vinegar and all that, maybe. Headmen often write. And so the sources that you are reading and getting out this sense of fear, etc., comes from the top. That's my assumption, okay? So people who are at the bottom, peasantry themselves, who write a lot, are they saying something very different? And so your perception, does it depend on the source, or can you generalize by reading all of them? So maybe I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks. Those are very good questions. On the horizontal, I've seen things from other parts of the country that are very similar in tone. So I think in general, I'm comfortable using the Kanto area as a kind of example that would stand in for many parts of the country. Though there'd be two things that I would have to qualify my own generalization with. One is the fact that the Kanto is the hinterland of Edo, and Edo as the capital is a different kind of place. And many of the people who are worried about rural society are worried because they think that Edo is sucking in commoners who might otherwise be working hard on their farms, and then sending out gamblers and gangsters and bad guys, so that disorderly elements are thicker on the ground. And then the other thing about the Kanto, and it's not just the Kanto, but one of the distinctive things about it is that there aren't any really big domains that control wide swaths of territory. A lot of the land is divided up into sort of subdomainal units, bannerman territories, even temples like Zojoji has some villages. And moreover, individual villages are sometimes divided up among several fief holders. So you might have a village that's divided into 4 units. It's socially and in some ways administratively one village, but taxes are going to 4 different places, and therefore they have 4 different headmen. And because peasants' own holdings are divided up within the village, I think literally, maybe literally, it was hard to tell what domain or who was supposed to be in charge in any given place within the village. And that meant that if something happened, who you're going to call becomes a serious question. And then the bannermen are often really poor, and they're very much disinclined to send people to deal with problems because they can't really afford to deal with it either. On the vertical question, I think you're right. So in this talk, I was talking about social commentators. Otaka Zenbei is a village headman, but obviously he's a kind of unusual person. In other research that I've done, and I might have been able to, that I could have drawn on, I have other village headmen expressing lots of concern about gamblers and gangsters. Below that level, it's harder to see because of the lack of sources, though people do seem to respond enthusiastically when given the opportunity to arm themselves, for example, to protect themselves. But also, I think, as I said at some point, I think if you're really downtrodden and just getting by each day, the poorest peasants, and maybe for many of the women too, who are working very hard, that they don't really have time. They might be afraid, but they don't have time to do anything about that fear because they have to work in the fields, they have to feed their children, that kind of thing. So that, in that sense, I do think that indulging one's fear is a kind of luxury for many people. Yeah.
Other questions from the audience?
Sort of.
You're next.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Hey, David, thank you. This is kind of following up on what you were just talking about and I guess the vertical side. It strikes me that maybe getting to some of the lower, commoner, more silent parts of the society, I wonder whether fear is contagious in some way that you might think about, and thus whether atmosphere and climate might be as effective as the more transactional economy that you've been using to show a shared group of meanings and feelings and in this case, fear.
So climate is a kind of metaphor.
Something that might encompass the contagion, the notion of a fear that would be shared. Obviously not the same fears, not the same anxieties, but just playing again at the risk of going superficially towards the terminology. A colleague asked about fear. I'm wondering about economy and whether there isn't something in the atmosphere, the climate, that allows the fear to spread up and down to various different perspectives.
That's really interesting. I'm kind of a crypto economic determinist, so I go for the economy line a lot, but I'll have to think about that. Yeah, it is. In traditional Japanese medicine, there was no miasmatic theory of disease, so I can't responsibly use a term like miasma, but certainly the idea, thinking about it as fear in the air or something like that.
I get that thanks to E.P. Thompson, the economy goes everywhere and is pervasive in ways that are beyond commercial. But it just strikes me that there's something else there.
Yeah, and we do talk about economic climate, so I guess I could have my cake and eat it too. Yeah. Ken and I were colleagues at Princeton when we were both members of the downtrodden assistant professoriate. So it's nice to see Ken and me both grown up and and happy.
Just one addition. Maybe you could look at broadsheets.
Uh-huh.
Maybe that would be one way to trace, kind of the circulation of humor.
Oh yes, so broadsheets, and then Miyachi Masato and others have written. There's actually a pretty big literature on the flows of information, and a lot of that actually centers on the Kanto, so it's a convenient place to work in that sense. Called Fusetsu Dome, which are information, often pretty high quality information that's circulated in the form of letters mostly among elite level peasant village headman types who often would have, like somebody might have a brother-in-law or a younger brother who was in service in a bannerman's household or in a daimyo household. So not a decision maker himself, but in the room as important news is being revealed or decisions are being made. That person, the brother-in-law, would write to his village headman relative, and then that village headman would tell his other village headman pals, or his other in-laws who were also village headmen, or also sake brewers or whatever, and then information would just spread. And Miyachi has documented how news of Perry's arrival just set off, because people have been corresponding for a long time, but with Perry, then this genre just explodes and remains very important. And he says more important than broadsheets per se, but that's another way of news getting around until the advent of newspapers in the early Meiji period.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I hope, can everybody hear me? Is this on? Well, boo.
Yeah.
Okay, now, okay. Listening to you talk about this tension between capital and country, about suspicion of commoners, and so on, it kind of takes me back to the Mappo period of the late Heian, where, I mean, a lot of the social problems you describe are practically the same. I mean, to the extent that we know about them, we know a lot less about life in the country, for example, than we do in the late Edo period. But the idea of the peasants refusing to turn over their goods, even though they ought to the nobles who come for them is very common. The nobles who are anxious, if not afraid, that the world is falling apart, that their society is coming to pieces. It all sounded sort of like deja vu all over again, and which made me wonder, is this not just a kind of like a ribbon going through Japanese history, this, and it's just better developed and better researched and so on in the late Edo period? And I'm sort of interested to see what you might think about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's something I've sort of noticed. I'm not a medieval or a Heian specialist, but even during the Tokugawa period, almost from the beginning in the 17th century, many of the complaints that the authorities had in the 19th century, they're already, peasants these days, give me a break, that kind of thing. And so in a sense, it is more of the same. I think there are three things that I would say. One, maybe to myself. One is that I do think that the level goes up, the volume increases as we get closer to the restoration. But after about the Tenmei crisis of the 1780s, a huge famine, there's reform, a period of prosperity, but from the 1780s and onward, it seems that the perception that something is really wrong seems to grow. For example, in 1827, I just mentioned in passing, but the shogunate tries to do a major reorganization of police authority in the Kanto area, empowering a police force to cross domainal boundaries and sort of, and it's like sending in the National Guard in a way that they'd never done before. And so in terms of like a policy response, there does seem to be a perception that things have changed in a way. And I can see that in other realms too, but I won't, in the interest of time, I won't go down the whole list. Another thing is that, and this is maybe getting back to my fixation on the term economy, is that I see more attempts to quantify the problems. So Zenbei and his, people buying tea rather than growing it themselves costs the economy this much. Throughout the Tokugawa period, there is a kind of, I think of the Tokugawa period as one marked by sort of a taxonomical urge, counting and classifying. They're doing that all the time. But the kind of quantifying the economy as something new, as a way of arguing about social policies, rather than just saying, the world is going to hell. So that may be a difference, even though the themes are the same, the way of expressing them is different. And then the final problem, and this is one that I think is sort of at the heart of my task, trying to write a short book about the Meiji Restoration, is, so what does this have to do with the Meiji Restoration? Does this cause the Meiji Restoration? How does this fit into the Meiji Restoration? If peasants have always been lazy and out of control, and elites have always been worried about society falling apart, what is it about the 19th century? If it's not different, then does that mean that all of this that the Restoration has nothing to do with this? In some ways, that argument has been made, that it was the foreign threat, it was a coup d'etat by a relatively small number of people against a small number of other people, and then sort of willy-nilly, Japan had a modern revolution after 1868. But I think my response to that would be that at some point, the Tokugawa regime seems to have lost legitimacy, lost its hold on people. Not to the extent that the commoners were going to rise up in revolution or anything like that, but a kind of lost sense of faith in the ability of the authorities to deal with the problems. And I think that's where I see in, this would be a totally different paper, but the popularity of things like Hirata nativism in the late Tokugawa years, the idea of, I think, that the demographic for that type of thing was rooted in the countryside. The very same sort of village headman types or their relatives joined. And I like to think of those people having a desire to be part of a kind of what we would now call a kind of nation-building project, that it's a common enterprise. They have agency, they're invested in this project, they're really interested in this project, they're working together in their own localities for a better Japan. And then you see the same men or their sons during the freedom and popular rights movement of the 1870s and 1880s joining the Liberal Party and agitating for parliamentary democracy, because their roles as village headmen have been largely taken away. Village autonomy is slipping away rapidly, and it would go away entirely. So they want to feel like they're part of a kind of nation-building project. The Kokugaku nativism isn't the idiom for that anymore, but Western-style parliamentary democracy is. But in both cases, it's the same sort of people with the same kind of longing to be part of a bigger project. And so I think that fear, or what I'm calling fear, the sense that bad guys are assaulting our villages and we're in constant danger, and the authorities won't do or can't do anything to help us, so we have to help ourselves, lay behind, at least for that village elite stratum, a sense that maybe we should let the other guys try. All the king's men and all the king's horses and all the king's men. So after the horses have had their try, let's let the king's men give a try. Sorry. I didn't plan that one out ahead. Anyway, so Tokugawa isn't working anymore. Let's give the other guys a chance. And then by the time they sort of decide whether they like it or not, it's too late because they have forged a new regime.
Thanks for the really interesting talk. And I'm glad that you brought up you went back to the Hirata kind of movement, because I think that actually in some ways, it made me think more about, I guess, your question about contagion, and there's different types of fear. And since you mentioned Taseko, and I was thinking of Van Walthel's work, and the kind of, just the concern around mobility at different points and what kinds of mobility. And it's interesting to think about the fact that in some ways the commoners are concerned about the mobility or the kind of subjection to violence that they're facing from gamblers and extortionists and so forth, but there's a way in which that mobility, that's realized to a certain extent through things like, this kind of nativism, Hirata nativism, on the part of the villagers is also about a certain kind of social or kind of, if not economic, but actually kind of some aspiration to be mobile in a different way.
Yeah.
And so these things are actually kind of competing in some ways, or at least in some kind of relationship that seems really interesting to consider.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking about in terms of this, I keep looking at this really resonant quote, and I was thinking about, kind of other ways that fear can have some kind of relationship to economy, and I think, thinking about popular visual art and narrative, and whether that's in broadsheets or something that precedes broadsheets, or in a popular fiction, there is a way to capitalize on that fear in terms of monetizing it for, to sell it, or to say sensationalize in a different way. And I'm just wondering if there's not kind of maybe a place to push in terms of thinking about kind of how fear can be deployed in different industries to kind of force some kind of economic gain as well. So to not just have this as an anecdote that's just kind of a fun way into it, but also to think about how this kind of genre has its own kind of economy of fear that kind of is layered on top of or intersects with this kind of this other notion.
Yeah. So when I first encountered the Utsuro Bune story, I think it was in a talk that Lawrence Marceau of the University of Auckland was giving about Bakin, and he showed this, and I think he argued that Bakin had invented the story, which I found very persuasive at the time, because the princess is supposed to have arrived in 1803, but the story was written only in 1825. 1825 is the year after the British whalers had shown up, and then that had led the shogunate to declare a policy of firing on any foreign vessels that approached Japan. So it was a time of high anxiety about foreign things. And it's a fun story. And almost all the other versions of the story we have, including the one that gave me this illustration, post-date 1825. And also Bakin wrote it in the context of his participation in a group called the Toenkai that he helped found. And it was a group of literati that got together once a month to tell stories of the amazing and the fantastic. And other members of the group also wrote about this incident. So I thought, okay, case closed. And then I found a different source from 1815 that talks about this incident. Also attributing it maybe to a foreign princess. There's a lot of detail, including this line that's not. The other account is very short. So it does seem that something was there and then wasn't well known, and then Bakin made it well known. And it became very popular. It was a very popular story in the late Tokugawa period because people are fascinated by the foreign and by the kind of, I don't think she's scary exactly, but it is, but the theory was that the box held the severed head of her lover. So there's a kind of dark side to the whole thing. But when I first encountered the story, then I thought, oh, this is a perfect kind of marker of the anxiety. But there are lots of other things too. Like I showed a slide of the famous gambler and gangster Kunisada Chuji, who was a very popular, kind of a Robin Hood figure, well known at the time. And there were a lot of like Naniwa Bushi and other oral literature recounted the stories of sort of what we would eventually think of as Yakuza gangsters in the Kanto area in a really interesting way, so that they're entertaining stories, just as we love more, mafia and great grist for popular culture. You have stories of gamblers and gangsters and their honor and their battles that are very entertaining. But at the same time, the people who actually lived in places terrorized by those people didn't think it was so much fun at all. Yojimbo, the Kurosawa movie, actually takes place in the Kanto in the 1860s, and the police force that was created in 1827 is going through, and so they have to pretend that everything's okay while the officials go through, and then they can go back to fighting among themselves. Yeah, so there's a lot in the popular culture as well. Sorry, that long-winded answer.
So I think we have time for one last question.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This is very, very interesting. So I thought this kind of psychological dynamics, responses to fear, grounded in economy and foreign relationships and so on, that's just fascinating. And I think, it seemed to me that there are multiple ways to handle fear when that happens. So you can actively address it by changing the system, for example, maybe creating norms or different taxation systems and tightening the system. So that's one way to handle it. But I wonder if something like conspicuous consumption or just indulgence in sake or something like this could be alternative way, and maybe just ignoring it could also be another way of handling it. So it seemed to me that many facets of the whole story that you eliminated so nicely could be related in this way, as opposed to, well, sometimes, well, sure, I mean, some part, say, for example, this indulgence or laziness of peasantry may be a cause for additional fear for, governing class, which you emphasized. But this indulgence itself could be some reaction to fear. Maybe that has to do with Kurofune, or maybe that has something to do with maybe something going on, at least in the perception of those people. So I wonder if you might have any comments on this. But then next question could be, oh, well, things change, right? So you are focusing on this particular time period, and maybe there might be some other period in which fear is relatively less for a variety of reasons. So I wonder if there might be any historical document kind of showing some support, that is, maybe people might not be engaging in conspicuous assumption as much. Possibly. That seems like one implication of this kind of story. So I wonder if you have any thought on this. And finally, how about North Korea right now?
Oh. I guess I was asking for the third question. Thank you very much for the interesting questions. I think, thinking more expansively, of course, whether consumption is conspicuous consumption and decadence or not is in the eye of the beholder. But there are also, like in the late Tokugawa period, there were large-scale mass pilgrimages to Ise, the Ise Mairi, and in the so-called Yonaoshi uprisings and Eiji Naika at the very end of the Tokugawa period. So various types of millenarian movements, the popularity of mass pilgrimage to various places. And I'm a very secular kind of historian, so I feel nervous talking too much about religion, especially with like distinguished scholars of religion in the room here. But in a way, that's a way of addressing fears by going on a pilgrimage, but also showing that people have the money and leisure to be able to afford to go on a pilgrimage. And I think maybe historians of Tokugawa Japan, when they write about such things, mostly it's been people interested in travel and culture who have done it and sort of downplay the religious aspects of going on a pilgrimage, that it's the fun on the road more than the pilgrimage per se. And then some scholars who are interested in religious practice focus on the pilgrimage per se. But in both cases, there isn't that much of the broader kind of political and economic climate, except to say that people had the money and leisure to do so. So that might also be a way of thinking about it, about addressing anxiety or fear, but also consuming, because I mean, you can be prosperous and still be afraid, obviously. I think with the second question about, that one's hard to answer, because I think from the outside, outside observers had a kind of physiocratic notion of society, that the only source of wealth, true wealth and prosperity, was agricultural production. And they also felt that the more labor you put into agricultural production, the more you would get out of it, even though you reach a certain point of diminishing returns. So that might also account for why outsiders looking in always feel that the peasants are being lazy and decadent. And so it's hard to find expressions otherwise. Whereas when peasants write about agriculture, I mean, they think about inputs, they think about fertilizer, they think about technology. And there it's a very kind of agronomical science with some moral overtones, but not too much. And North Korea, just keep the hands off the buttons, please. That's all I have to say.
No, we should conclude the formal part of our talk, but before we adjourn, please join me in thanking Professor Howell one more time for getting our year off to a great start. Thank you.
Thank you very much.